Chapter 22. From the Shadows. The entire town of Goodhots was buzzing with preparations for Hallows Eve. Every street corner, every store window and front yard was adorned with spooky decorations. Paper ghost garlands hung in windows, and grinning pumpkins with candles inside glowed from fences, casting eerie shadows. With his mother's help, Ferry decked out their front yard in monstrous attire. Old clothes were transformed into waving spectres, giving a shiver to passing children. Eileen, like other mothers in town, had meticulously crafted Fairy's costume, a raven with sweeping wings and a pointed beak. As soon as the shadows settled, Ferry, Matilda, and Ben set off. Ben wore a green alien costume, painted by his sisters, while Matilda went as a ghost, donning an old bedsheet with holes as eyes. Their neighbors greeted them warmly. As always, Fairy's singing charmed everyone, as guising meant putting on a show for treats. In the central square, they joined the group of little monsters and creatures of the night, each carrying a lantern pumpkin to light their way. As they took a rest near the grocery store to count the candies, apples, and other treats, Ferry spotted May across the street. She was with Billy and Cecilia, who led a lively group of children. This time, Billy didn't recognize Ferry and his group. The costumes he and Cecilia wore were different, a pirate for him and a princess for Cecilia. May, who wore a fairy costume with delicate wings and a wreath of flowers over her crocheted cap, caught Ferry's gaze. When their eyes met, she smiled, sending a wave his way. And in that enchanting moment, time seemed to stand still. Meanwhile, Matilda and Ben were busy arguing over who got the biggest chocolate candy bar. "We should head home, Ferry." Matilda's voice snapped Ferry out of his thoughts. "It's getting late." They stood at the edge of town, facing a dark hill. But Ferry couldn't help but stop when he saw a house with the lone dimly lit window. It was different from the rest, lacking any Hallows Eve decorations. "Come on, Ferry," Ben whispered urgently, "let's go." "That's Mrs. Cobb's house." Ferry remembered Mrs. Cobb's, the woman from the fires, the mother of the missing girl. She rarely left her home, cared for only by her niece, Tootsie. Their house stood dark and gloomy, a stark contrast to the cheerful limestone homes around. "Why are we whispering?" Ferry asked, his eyes fixated on the house. "Because they say Mrs. Cobb's is a bit strange," Matilda answered in a hushed tone. Long ago, when she could still walk, she'd wander the shepherd's forest, calling out for her daughter. And shortly after her girl vanished, her husband disappeared too. Some folks say she lost her mind and killed him. They say his ghost roams these streets, seeking revenge, Matilda said with a shiver. "We should go. They say on Hallows Eve, the spirits of the dead come back." "I don't want to meet her husband's ghost," she said, her voice tinged with fear. But Ferry didn't move. He remembered how people in town spoke about Lavender Sky, calling her mad, yet they couldn't have been more wrong. Ignoring his friend's pleas, he stepped closer to the house. With a push, the heavy gate creaked open, revealing an overgrown garden. Weeds and tangled shrubs reached out like grasping tentacles, reclaiming the space. A sweet, fruity scent hung in the air, though autumn had long passed, and no fruit should have remained. Soft tinkling sounds echoed with each gust of wind, adding to the eeriness in the air. "Can I borrow your torch?" Ferry asked Ben in a whisper, feeling his courage waver. Ben handed over his pocket torch, which he always carried, hoping to one night encounter an extraterrestrial. When Ferry flicked on the torch and illuminated the garden, an eerie sight greeted them. Hanging from the bare branches were the sweetest temptations, lollipops, candy apples, and honey-dripped wooden spoons. Jars of jam and marmalade swung gently on ropes, emitting a tantalizing aroma. Apples, walnuts, strawberries, and other fruits adorned the scene, enticing yet unsettling. Despite the tempting display, no child dared to breach the rusty fence and enter the garden. Carefully navigating through the tangled roots, Ferry, Matilda, and Ben approached, both intrigued and wary of the mysterious landscape. Matilda pointed out the sweets, wondering if they were intended for guising children. "They're traps," Ferry explained solemnly. "Sweet fairy traps. But they won't catch a fairy." "Why not?" Matilda asked, puzzled. "Because fairies don't have wings," Ferry replied with a furrowed brow. "How do you know that?" Matilda insisted. Ferry didn't answer. He marched toward the grey house's door, ignoring his friend's protests. He knocked on the weathered oak door adorned with a lion-shaped knocker, the sound reverberating through the silence. "Even the strangest people deserve visitors on Hallows Eve," said Ferry. A few moments later, the door creaked open, and a distant voice warned them to leave. Matilda urged them to retreat. She quickly descended the stairs, followed by Ben while Ferry remained at the door, undeterred by the ominous warning. But before they could reach the last stair, a rattling voice stopped them on their way. "Tootsie, let them in." The door groaned open like a fortress gate, revealing a dimly lit hallway. Tootsie, Mrs. Cobb's niece, disappeared into the shadows, leaving only her silhouette visible. The children stood frozen at the entrance, enveloped in silence. Soon, they heard a rhythmic sound growing louder. A shiver ran down their spine as Mrs. Cobbs emerged from the darkness, leaning on her walking stick. Despite her frail appearance, she exuded an air of strength and elegance in her silk blouse and skirt. "What have we here?" she rasped, handing them a package wrapped in newspaper. "Only apple pie, I'm afraid." "Thank you, madam," Matilda said, accepting the package. "Can we go now?" she whispered urgently to Ferry. But Mrs. Cobbs fixed her gaze on Ferry, her clouded eyes seeming to see beyond. "You are one of the unseen," she said, her voice trembling. "Do you know what happened to my Poppy? Please, tell me." Ferry stammered, "I'm sorry, madam, I don't know." "You're one of the unseen," she repeated, her finger pointing at Ferry's face. "That's it. Let's go," Matilda urged, tugging at Ferry's sleeve. They fled from the garden, Mrs. Cobb's voice echoing behind them, pleading for her daughter's return. Breathless, they stopped under a street lamp, trying to make sense of what happened. Matilda scolded them for visiting Mrs. Cobbs, dismissing her words as the ramblings of a madwoman. But why did she call Ferry one of the unseen? Ben wondered, still shaken. She probably couldn't see him clearly, Matilda reasoned. She's almost blind, remember? Ferry felt a sense of dread gnawing at him, a feeling that had haunted him all evening. As they walked home in silence, he couldn't shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "I don't feel too good," Matilda whispered, stopping. "Me neither," Ben added. "Maybe we had too many candies." It wasn't that though. A few houses away, someone was hiding behind a tree on the other side of the street. The street lamps on the side went down for a few seconds and then flickered. Their light was strong enough to reveal the figure behind the tree. It looked like a tall man, taller than any other man in Goodhots. He was watching them. He wore a long dark coat, his face somehow hidden behind a white mask. And he seemed to be floating. Ferry had the strangest feeling that it was the same presence at the playground, the one in Billy's photos. Soon, Matilda noticed the stranger behind a tree. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who?" said Ferry, starting to walk again. "That man behind the tree," she said, Looking back, it's probably someone coming home from a Hallows Eve party. Ferry tried to calm her down. They kept walking, glancing behind them. The silhouette followed, and at one point, it seemed to be getting closer. To their horror, they realized the face behind the mask was not a mask at all, but a featureless face. "I don't like it, Ferry," Ben whimpered, nearly in tears. "Me neither," Matilda whispered. "I can barely breathe, and I don't feel well," she added in a faint voice. Ferry felt the same unease creeping over him. The stranger was drawing nearer. Fear surged through him. "Run," he shouted. His friends didn't hesitate, and they sprinted. Ferry, despite being the fastest, couldn't leave them behind. They dashed through back streets, hoping to lose their pursuer, but the silhouette continued its relentless race. Eventually, the children abandoned their costumes and lanterns, but it made no difference. They found themselves trapped in an unfamiliar street, with a towering brick wall blocking their escape. Exhausted and with no way out, they huddled together as the silhouette closed in on them. Ferry stood in front of his friends, shielding them with his body. The shadowy presence drew nearer, emanating a foul odor that made Ferry feel dizzy. He couldn't bring himself to look at its face, fearing what he might see. Instead, he focused on their surroundings. The deserted marketplace offered no refuge, except for a solitary street lamp casting a dim glow. As the creature approached, Ferry's mind raced for a solution. Then, he remembered the moonlight. With his last strength, he guided his friends into the light. To his amazement, the creature recoiled as if scorched by the moon's rays. With a pained howl, it retreated into the darkness and vanished, leaving the three friends shaken, but unharmed.